it's the worst economic crisis that Sri Lanka has ever seen since its independence. And a question is, why has this happened? So essentially, it's a story of more expenses but less revenue that has led to a cash-strapped Sri Lanka. Now, it started long ago. In 2009, the country started focusing on domestic consumption to cut export earnings. Now, at the end of its civil war in 2009, Sri Lanka decided to focus on providing goods only to its domestic market instead of trying to boost exports. Now, this meant that its income from exports to other countries remained low, while the bill for imports kept growing. So they continued importing goods, but they stopped exporting goods. That's why they were paying a lot of money in imports, but they weren't receiving any money for exports, as they only kept their goods inside the domestic market. Now, following that, in 2019, let's cut to 2019, when Gotabaya Rajapaksa got elected as the president of Sri Lanka. Right in 2019, sharp tax cuts were announced by the Rajapaksa government that stripped the revenue base of the country. The government cut the VAT rate from 12% to 8%, and this costed Sri Lanka $2.2 billion annually. Now, these government policies made expenses far exceeding the revenue of the Sri Lanka, and it stripped the government of the basic revenue that comes from its taxes. Now, in 2019-20, another reason happened, that were the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka that killed over 250 people. This made tourists wary of coming into Sri Lanka. Then, in 2020, we had the pandemic. Both of these reasons hurt the tourism industry, that is a lucrative industry for Sri Lanka. It's the third largest source of foreign exchange for Sri Lanka in the year 2019. So the tourism industry being hit meant that a major source of foreign exchange for Sri Lanka was hit, and a major source of foreign exchange could not realize for Sri Lanka starting 2019-20. That's why the foreign exchange reserves went further down. Now, let's move to 2020 to 21. The government took large loans to fund their infrastructure projects. Now, this led to a debt trap for the government. They took a foreign debt of $35 billion. Their total foreign debt surged to $35 billion in the year 2021, and 10% of Lanka's foreign debt was sourced from China. So Sri Lanka was taking a lot of loans to fund their infrastructure projects, and then they were also taking loans to repay their earlier loans. This was leading to a debt trap for Sri Lanka, and that is why the country currently is stripped out of their foreign exchange reserves. Now, in 2021, there was another decision that hurt the economy at large, and specifically the agricultural industry and the food supplies of the country. The government decided to ban chemical fertilizers, and they decided to completely go organic with their farming. But this triggered a drop in crop produce, as chemical fertilizers were completely banned. Now, to tackle this and to tackle the domestic food supply, the government had to import more food, and that made the foreign exchange shortage worse, because they now had to pay more for food imports, as they had to import more food because of a less domestic production. Now, let's move to August 2021. The government had no foreign exchange reserves to pay for food imports, and that is why the government declared a food emergency in August 2021. And in 2021-22, that's we saw in the first few months of this year, multiple credit agencies downgraded Sri Lanka. Agencies such as Fitch downgraded Sri Lanka to restrictive default after the country defaulted on making international sovereign bond payments. Of course, this happened because the country was stripped out of cash. They had no cash to pay, and this meant that international organizations won't lend money to Sri Lanka because of its record of defaulting on its payments. So, of course, Sri Lanka lent a lot of money. They were paying out a lot in terms of imports, and that is why their foreign exchange reserves were going down. They didn't have enough money, and in 2022, Sri Lanka was logged out of international capital markets because they didn't have the money. They just didn't have the money to pay out. And in May 2022, we saw Lanka defaulted on all of its foreign debt for the first time in its history. Now, why was Lanka not able to pay these debts? Because its foreign exchange reserves needed to make the payments completely dried up, and one of the reasons was that the money Sri Lanka paid for imports far exceeded the money they received from exports. Annual imports are over $3 billion more than exports, and that means that Sri Lanka ran out of their forex reserves. And in May 2022, foreign reserves plummeted 70% in just the last 20 years. And because of a scarcity of funds, Lanka could not pay for its imports of basic essentials such as fuel and food. And of course, the scarcity of these resources drove up their prices. In June, inflation skyrocketed to 55%, hitting a record high for the 9th straight month. With no forex reserves to pay for basic essentials, because of all of these reasons, in March 2022, protesters and Sri Lankans took to the streets, marching against their government because they could not buy their basic essentials, and their country had to struggle to even buy basic things such as fuel and food because of the government's policies and because of the government's mismanagement of the economy. These were all of the reasons that have taken Sri Lanka down to the deepest economic crisis it has ever seen.